Sierra Leone makes his return to the track, some updates on the future of racing in Florida, and where all the Bob Baffert horses going to be running next. That and more on this episode of the Win Play Show. Salutations and welcome, friends. My name is Matthew DeSantis, and this is another episode of the Win Play Show, a program devoted to covering all topics of horse racing and handicapping. Now, before we get into a lot of great stories that we have to cover this week, I want to remind you all to press that like button and subscribe to NYRA Bet's YouTube today. Subscribing is entirely free of cost, just notifies you when new videos are dropping on the channel, whether it be weekly programs like this one, our race previews, full card analyses, handicapping and betting tutorials, top 5 videos like we have right now up on the Kentucky Derby, which, by the way, thank you to all the new viewers and subscribers to that. And we're going to have some fun Kentucky Oaks coverage in that same vein. And we'll have some updated top 5 lists as we get closer to the Kentucky Derby as well. Like I said, welcome to the Win Play Show, where we're going to be talking about a lot of different topics today, because this is an exciting time of year in horse racing. You got horses coming back. Obviously, Sierra Leone, one of those that we'll touch on here in a little bit. The Triple Crown picture is coming into a little bit more clarity. You get turf racing starting to come back, and some of the big turf courses and the horses are starting to make their returns. So a lot of exciting things going on in the sport right now. Before we look ahead, though, I want to look back at what we saw last weekend up at Colonial Downs. And that was a really interesting 3-day event, because Colonial normally has their meet in the summer and fall, and they are defined largely by their turf course, which is, in my eyes, the best turf course in the country. I think their turf course is just absolutely outstanding. I absolutely love it. It's a beautiful track. It's beautifully maintained, and they just have a really, really great setup down there. But obviously in mid-March, turf was not yet ready. So all of the racing was done over the main track. One of the things people learned very quickly was that Colonial Downs has a very speed-favoring main track. Also, it should be pointed out, the caliber of horses, I would even go as far as saying the caliber of maidens that Colonial saw this past weekend is unlike what they typically see. A lot of times they have nice horses running on the main track, but those main track races are optional claimers. They're claiming races. They're maiden claimers. They're not the highest caliber fields. No disrespect to the horses running, but you saw a completely different caliber of horse running over the main track as you did in previous meets. And I think the question that is natural to ask is, are the results we saw from last weekend at Colonial replicable to another track next time out? I think there's some significant questions there. I know a horse like American Promise, for instance, my colleague Kaylee Shapiro, really high on that horse. That was her top pick in that Virginia Derby. She's very bullish on his chances moving forward. I'm a little more skeptical. I kind of need to see it replicated around 2 turns on a track that might not be quite as speed favoring, and in a pace where, he might get burned up a little bit more going a little bit longer. So it'll be interesting to see. Even a horse like Fondly, who I was very high on, came back with a rather slow buyer speed figure in her victory in the Virginia Oaks. But again, need to see that replicated in some capacity. And then you also have a couple of maidens for Brad Cox, Line of Justice and Verifier, both of whom earned 92 buyer speed figures in debut. Now, whenever a maiden earns a 90-plus buyer on debut, you go, wow, okay, that really catches your attention. Again, the speed favoring nature of the track, the caliber of competition the horses were facing. I think there's reasons not to be skeptical necessarily, but at least be cautious about maybe not jumping to conclusions on either of those horses, though they are both beautifully bred and were both horses that I really liked in that race if you watch my Capping the Card episode. But it was still, you need to see that kind of backed up again, maybe another time out at another track against different caliber of competition. So it'll be interesting to see. One thing that I should note is the past weekend, there were a lot of successes. I know Saturday was jam-packed day. Governor Youngkin was there. Everybody was, very excited, very happy about the turnout, and understandably so. It was a Chamber of Commerce day, too. It was beautiful weather down there, Colonial Downs in New Kent, Virginia. The previous 2 days, listen, just to be honest, you could, hear a pin drop in a lot of ways. I mean, there were not many people out the track on Thursday and Friday. A lot of people out Saturday. That's great. The other reality is there were a lot of scratches. And that was very disappointing, that there were a lot of scratches throughout the 3 days. From a betting standpoint, the product was not spectacular. I think the early pick 5 on Saturday paid $37, if I'm not mistaken. I told you it was chalky. My mistake on capping the card was maybe not being chalky enough. And I thought I was being too chalky. But, that was not great to see that sort of betting product out there. Now, the racing product was a lot of fun. And it was a great couple of stories there to close things out. Obviously, the coach winning the Virginia Derby with American Promise. But still, overall, a lot of scratches. And then also there was a kind of an equine herpes outbreak at Laurel Park, which affected Gulfstream Park. It affected New York even a little bit. We're not accepting horses coming in from those tracks. Somehow Colonial managed to avoid that despite a lot of horses cross-pollinating between Laurel and Colonial. So, I mean, just fingers crossed, everybody, all the horses are going to come out of this healthy. But like I said, it was a successful 3-day festival. If you look at it from a standpoint of that Saturday event, I do think there are some questions moving forward in terms of caliber of horses that are being sent there for that 3-day festival and the amount of scratches. Now, this was the first year, so maybe this is something that will grow over time. But like I said, I think Thursday and Friday were a little underwhelming. Saturday was a great day for racing in Virginia. And again, I'm a big fan of Colonial Downs. Lived in Northern Virginia for a few years. My mom lives about an hour from the track and love going there. Love supporting the product and love supporting the track and all the people there. But like I said, the 3-day festival, some hits, some misses. But listen, that's to be expected the first time you do anything. Now, let's move forward and let's take a look at some of the big stories that are coming up this coming week. And one of the big stories that has emerged over the last couple of days is Owen Almighty. This is a horse that won, of course, the Tampa Bay Derby, finished second in the Sam F. Davis to John Hancock, who is your morning line favorite in this weekend's Louisiana Derby. This is a horse that Brian Lynch, the trainer, has openly said, listen, he should be going to the Pate Mile. He's a one-turn horse. He's a sprinter moving forward. But, the owners, they get Derby fever. They have a horse that has a lot of Derby points, understandably so. And so this horse is now being rerouted to the Bluegrass. Now, going from the Tampa Bay Derby to the Bluegrass is not anything new. Tapit Trice did this a few years ago, went from one to the other. We've seen horses make that jump from the Tampa Bay Derby to the Bluegrass. The spacing of the races is appropriate, and so it's not really an issue. The issue is whether or not this is really what's best for the horse, and whether or not going 9 furlongs against a much tougher caliber of competition is going to ultimately be what is going to be best for this horse. Remember, this is a horse that's been aided by a speed favoring track going a mile and a 16th the last 2 times out. Last time managed to get a very easy lead on that Tampa Bay Derby victory. Now you're going to the Bluegrass. You're probably going to be facing River Thames. You're also going to be facing East Avenue on the front end, and you're going a little bit longer. Now, I know Keeneland can hold up speed pretty well, although I don't know if it can hold up speed as well as Tampa Bay Downs, but it can hold up speed pretty well. But you do worry about, does this horse maybe just get a little worn out? Now, the counter argument, and by the way, the owners have every right to point this horse wherever the owners want to point this horse, and it's their horse. They want to run this horse in an allowance race at Penn National, they can do that. They want to run this horse in the Bluegrass, they can do that too. But I think we are hoping as fans for more of a Seize the Gray type trajectory for Owen Almighty, where Seize the Gray, if you remember, goes to the Bluegrass last year, runs an okay but not great race, and ultimately is taken off the Derby trail and goes to the Pate Mile, which of course he wins, and then backs it up 2 weeks later in the Preakness. Now, I don't know if Owen Almighty's going to the Preakness, but I do like this idea of maybe using the Bluegrass as a little bit of a prep for the Pate Mile, even if you don't get it. Now, my concern is, unlike Seize the Gray, Owen Almighty is basically already assured a starting spot in the Kentucky Derby with that victory of the Tampa Bay Derby. So my concern is that no matter where he finishes in the Bluegrass, the owners are going to say, hey, we already got a spot in the Kentucky Derby. We're going to the Kentucky Derby. And again, the son of Spatestown going 1.25 miles, call me skeptical. But we'll see. We'll see. Again, this is more of like what I would just love to see for the horse in terms of, I think he's going to be at his best doing 1 turn and going 1 mile, going 7 furlongs and going that kind of Pate Mile, H. Allen Jerkins, Woody Stevens type trajectory throughout the year. Those are the types of races I would love to see him in. But again, the owners have every right to put the horse where they want. We saw this a couple of years ago with a horse like Classic Causeway, who's also trained by Brian Lynch. Brian didn't think going to the Derby was the best idea. The owners disagreed, moved the horse to Kenny McPeak. Classic Causeway did get a win going long on the turf, but outside of that, had a pretty nondescript career and has also kind of kind of become a little bit of a laughing stock in terms of, being sent over to Royal Ascot at one point and setting the pace in these turf races. And, just it was the career that you hope the horse would have. And so, again, you just want to see what's best for this horse and ultimately where this horse can show his best version of himself. And so we'll have to see where that is for Owen Almighty. Now, one horse that is hoping to show the best version of himself this Saturday is Sierra Leone. The Breeders' Cup Classic champion from last year is coming back and making his 2025 debut for trainer Chad Brown, and he is doing it in the New Orleans Classic on what is going to be a beautiful day, sunny and 74 degrees in the Big Easy for Louisiana Derby Day. Can't ask for better weather than that. But it's going to be exciting to see Sierra Leone come back just a couple of weeks, of course, after Torpedo Anna made her 2025 debut. Fierceness is back on the work tab. You've had Mindframe, who's already debuted. Locked is now kind of in full steam after winning that big cap out at Santa Anita and getting a grade 1 to his name after winning the Cigar Mile. So, there's suddenly this older handicap division for both the boys and the girls is shaping up a little bit better. Side note about the girls, Where's My Ring? 103 Beyer speed figure in an allowance race at Oaklawn this past week. That's going to be interesting to see if she can really challenge Torpedo Anna in any way, shape, or form in that Apple Blossom in a couple of weeks. That could be a lot of fun. But going back to Sierra Leone, what's fascinating is it's a field of 10 in that New Orleans Classic. Now, the question is how many of them are actually going to run, because 4 of the 10 are cross-entered, including Kinetic Sky and Touch Upon a Star. And so if it goes down to a field of 6, how does that change the dynamics? Now, if you're a backer of Sierra Leone, the good news is there's still going to be a fair amount of pace signed on for this race. Hall of Fame, Como Rubino, Amoide, and Bishop's Bay are all entered in the race. They're not cross-entered anywhere else. All 3 of those horses like to be forward, like to be close to the lead. So presumably those 3 should be able to sit and set at least modest fractions. And remember, Sierra Leone likes this track. Came storming down the stretch in the Risen Star to win that race behind relatively modest fractions that day. So it'll be interesting to see how he's able to come back as a 4-year-old. First race off the bench. Of course, we saw Chancer McPatrick for Chad Brown finish second in that Tampa Bay Derby a couple weeks back. So going to be a lot of fun to see Sierra Leone come back. He's going to be a short price favorite, though, but going to be interesting to see who actually ends up running in the race, as that really does change pace dynamics quite a bit. Because if Touch Upon a Star and Kinetic Sky run, well, then there's a lot of speed in the race. And now it really sets up for Sierra Leone. Whereas if it's a shorter field, maybe a horse like Como Rubino Amoide, Hall of Fame, Bishop's Bay, one takes the lead, 2 of them track, nobody's really pressing. Suddenly, maybe it doesn't set up quite as well for Sierra Leone. And again, it'll be interesting to see, as from 3 to 4, how does Sierra Leone maybe change his running style a little bit? Does he sit a little bit closer? Can he be a little bit closer to the pace? So I think some really interesting dynamics there in that New Orleans Classic this weekend. Now, shifting from the track to some really important news taking place off of the track, and that is what's happening down in the Sunshine State of Florida. If you watched this show in the past, you know I've talked about the decoupling efforts of the Stronach Group and Gulfstream Park, and this idea that there is the potential for decoupling racing from the running of the casino at Gulfstream Park. And by decoupling, what I mean is they do not have to have live race days in order to run the casino. Right now, there's legislation that if you want to run the casino, you got to have live race days. And those you can't have those 2 things exist separately, or you can't eliminate live race days and continue to run the casino. Well, there is legislation that would decouple live race days from running the casino. This is a huge problem for South Florida and the potential future of racing in South Florida. Now, there's been a little bit of progress made. So this legislation passed the House committee, I think by a vote of 13-7, if I'm not mistaken. So it's still, listen, it's still early in the process, all right? So it's not something that's on the governor's desk tomorrow by any stretch of the imagination. Nothing moves quickly in Florida. I say that as somebody who studied political science at the University of Florida and lived in Florida for a grand total of 7 years. Nothing moves quickly in Florida, okay? And Florida politics is completely wackadoodle, which it just is. Doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on, it's nuts. It just there's a reason why every story is Florida man. I love Florida. It's my favorite state I've ever lived in, but it's a little bit wacky down there sometimes. Nevertheless, as it relates to the decoupling, there has been a little bit of a breakthrough. So there was going to be this 3-year notice that had to be issued to cease live racing. So the idea was if Stronach Group, basically, if Belinda Stronach said, we're going to cease live racing, then there was going to be a 3-year period by which you had to notify. And then after that 3-year period, you could actually decouple live race days from the casino and effectively put a termination date on live racing in South Florida. Well, there's been an amendment to the legislation in the Florida House, and now that 3-year notice cannot be issued before 2027. So now this is basically giving a 5-year window. Now, it's still a 3-year notice, but the fact that you can't issue the notice until 2027 basically makes it a 5-year window now. So it does address some of the concerns that the horsemen had about the imminent potential close of racing in South Florida. Kind of kicks the can down the road a little bit. I'll be honest. I mean, that's what this feels like. A little bit of negotiation, a little bit of kicking the can down the road, a little bit of let's give ourselves some time on this. Maybe we can, continue to revise these amendments and come up with alternatives, listen to the different sides, negotiate between all of this. But certainly, the horsemen, it's not something where they just want to keep kicking the can down the road. They want there to be some sort of commitment to racing from the state of Florida. And obviously defeating decoupling would be a big part of that. So we'll have to wait and see how this continues to play out. But I thought in the grand scheme of things, it's not a bad amendment for the horsemen, but it is something that is just kind of, like I said, a temporary stopgap and not much more than that. But I know last time I talked about this, I basically said, listen, live racing could be gone in 3 years. Now it looks like live racing in South Florida is at least going to be around for 5 years. We'll see. I mean, it's a big problem. And Tampa Bay Downs is affected by this to a lesser extent. There was an amendment in the legislation that brought in card rooms as well. And if you've ever been to Tampa Bay Downs, they have a card room upstairs. That said, Tampa Bay Downs is not a track that relies on their card room revenue, really. And so that's not as much of a factor. And so it's possible that after, if this ends up coming to pass and that in 5 years, maybe there isn't racing in South Florida anymore, presumably all of the horsemen would be going to Tampa Bay Downs, or a lot of the horsemen would be going to Tampa Bay Downs. So you'd still have racing in Florida, but it would look a little bit different, obviously. And Tampa Bay would have to really drastically overhaul their racing schedule, I would imagine, to accommodate the influx of horses and horsemen who would want to race there. So interesting to see. We'll continue to keep you up to date with these developments. Now, some other developments that are taking place that I feel like everybody is wanting to talk about are the Bob Baffert horses, the Avengers, as some people have coined the term, and where they're going for the Kentucky Derby. Obviously, we saw a horse like Getaway Car be a bit of a disappointment in the Virginia Derby. And so I think, even though Getaway Car probably has enough points to make it into the starting gate, Getaway Car is, I have a hard time thinking that Bob saw that effort and goes, yeah, we're going to go a 1.25 miles with this horse. So I have a feeling Getaway Car is going to be a miler. That's what I've always thought, even though he's sired by Curlin. I've never kind of gotten the impression that he was a horse that wanted to go a lot longer than 1 mile and a 16th. I thought that was kind of his max, but we'll see. But the big five, if you will, right now that are left are Barnes, Citizen Bull, Cornucopian, Gaming, and Rodriguez. Those are the five. Now, I'm not as bullish on Rodriguez, but to be fair to backers of Rodriguez, I also don't think he's ever been put in a position to really show his best stuff. I think he needs the lead. Bob has had him rating off of his other horses to this point, whether that be Barnes, whether that be Citizen Bull. I think you put Rodriguez on the lead, maybe he looks a little bit different. I think maybe he's got a chance to be a pretty nice horse. Again, I don't know about the distance, but still, I also don't think it's necessarily fair to judge him entirely by what he has shown to this point. Because if you remember, his maiden breaking victory, which was a 100 buyer speed figure, was pretty good, but also came on the lead. Now, what are we going to see from these others? Gaming has come back with a very strong 5 furlong bullet. Barnes has come back and worked with Cornucopian, and they went 6 furlongs and 111 and 4. And Citizen Bull came back and ran a 112 6 furlong work, which I believe is his third consecutive 6 furlong work. So Bob's putting a lot of foundation into Citizen Bull. He's putting some nice foundation into Cornucopian and Barnes. And Cornucopian, who's going to be stretching out for the first time after breaking his debut at 6 furlongs at Arkansas or at Oaklawn Park on that Rebel Day Stakes undercard. We'll see. It's interesting to see how the bloom has kind of come off the rose a little bit for some of the Baffert horses. And Citizen Bull continues to be the horse that Baffert certainly is treating like his alpha in the group. And I think some people think that's misguided, but, we don't see what Bob sees in the mornings. And I agree that Citizen Bull largely has gotten things his own way up on the lead very easily out west throughout the last couple of victories, particularly the Breeders' Cup Juvenile and the Robert B. Lewis. Those were easy leads, no pressure, gate to wire on speed favoring tracks. Can he do it when he's actually being pressed? Well, the question is, where's he going to be pressed before he goes to the Kentucky Derby? I don't know, because he's probably going to be running against other Bob Baffert horses, and even a horse like Journalism, who is, I think, the top horse coming out of California for Michael McCarthy. Journalism's a horse that sits off the pace. He's not going to be pressing Citizen Bull. So the question is, where's Citizen Bull really going to be facing pressure? Now, maybe they try to rate Citizen Bull, have him sit second or third and see if he can come from off the pace. Maybe they use the Santa Anita Derby to be a little bit of a testing ground because he's already guaranteed a spot in the starting gate. So it'll be interesting to see how they manage Citizen Bull. He's a horse who's, I feel like I have him ranked third in my top 5. I had somebody say, I'm crazy for not having him number 1. I also had people say I'm crazy for having him on the top 5 at all. He's become that type of a horse where I feel like you can't properly rate Citizen Bull. That wherever you rate him, people are going to go, what are you talking about? He's the reigning 2-year-old champion. He hasn't lost in months. All he does is win. He's one of the Bafferts. He's going to get to the lead. He's going to go. He's really impressive. Physically, he's an impressive horse as well. He's going to be able to do it. And others go, he hasn't faced any major competition. He doesn't face any pace pressure. He's been coddled out in California, and he's going to get absolutely smoked when he goes to Kentucky. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in between those 2 points. And so, which is often the case with not just horse racing, but with life. And we'll end up seeing where he ends up going and kind of how he ends up performing. But he's a horse who I was initially much more cold on Citizen Bull, and I think I've warmed up to him over these last few months. Of course, sometimes distance makes the heart grow fonder. I've not seen him run, and I've seen some other horses run and disappoint. You've seen a horse like East Avenue disappoint. You saw a horse like Ferocious disappoint. You've seen a horse like Chancellor McPatrick come back and run second, but still be a little disappointing there. So it's hard for me to go, even a horse like Jonathan's Way kind of has been taken off the Derby trail. Some of these horses that we were really excited about, not really coming through. So Citizen Bull, we'll see. Cornucopian and Barnes are the big X factors. I've watched that San Felipe a couple more times because Journalism is my number 1 horse. And I'll be honest, Barnes didn't run a bad race. It's just I think he ran into a monster of a horse in Journalism. And I do still have questions about whether Barnes can get 1.25 miles at Churchill, but he can absolutely win the Santa Anita Derby. I think he's good enough to do that. And we'll have to wait. We'll have to see. We'll have to see who goes where. And Bob has even said, we're not sure yet. But it looks like what Bob is considering is sending some to the Arkansas Derby, some to the Santa Anita Derby, potentially some to the Florida Derby as well. So it is interesting to see. I thought maybe he'd send 1 or 2 to the Bluegrass. Maybe he'd send one of them to the Wood. That was maybe just wishful thinking on my part because I'd like to see one of them up here. But nevertheless, he is going to be breaking them up at the very least between Oaklawn and Santa Anita and potentially sending one to Florida as well. But he said the next week is really going to determine all of this. But all 5 of these horses are working out well. We've also seen Sovereignty come back and work very well for Bill Mott leading up to the Florida Derby. We've seen a horse like East Avenue working out very nicely, likely going to the Bluegrass. So again, the Derby picture's coming into focus. Horses like Cole Battle, their ticket's already stamped. Citizen Bull, his ticket's already stamped. All these winners of the 50-point prep races, they're already in. Owen Almighty, if he wants to go, he's in. All right. Flood Zone, he's going over to the UAE Derby. I don't think he's going to be coming back to go to the Kentucky Derby, but if he wanted to, he was in already because he won the Gotham. So we'll have to wait and see how all of this plays out, but really fascinating to see how this group runs. Cornucopian's a horse that has just generated a ton of buzz and debate over the last couple of days on social media. Some people think he's outstanding. Other people think he's a complete toss and you can't get the distance. I have him ranked 5th. I think he's a very interesting wild card at this point. Nothing more than that, but I think he's really interesting. And so we will have to wait and see. Time will tell on all of this. And so, yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun to see where all the Bafferts end up going. Because whether you love Bob Baffert or dislike Bob Baffert, having him back in the Kentucky Derby injects a lot of horses into this discussion. And it brings a lot more horses into the discussion. It brings California more into the discussion. We haven't seen as many horses coming from California in recent years. Stronghold, certainly last year for D'Amato, but outside of that, not as many. And, we saw the kind of, well, we're going to train for Baffert, then we're going to go to Tim Yakteen, and then we're going to go to the Derby, and that really hasn't worked out at all. So this will be interesting to see how this all happens with his first year back in a few since that Medina Spirit controversy. Now, want to end on a positive note for horse players and give a huge congratulations to Dan Piazza on winning the National Horseplayers Championship this past weekend out in Las Vegas. If you're anywhere on social media, you've always seen the videos and the highlights of the players. Obviously, Dave Portnoy from Barstool was out there playing along. And so that got a lot of new eyeballs on the sport and on what we do for National Horseplayers Championship. So that was a lot of fun. But listen, congrats to Dan, who was dominant, was in the lead all 3 days of the tournament and really just extended his lead significantly in the second day and really wasn't really pressed that much on day 3 at all. Did really, really well. I think I earned, $352 based off of $2 win place bets across the 3 days. So very impressive showing. And what did he say? I don't play a lot of favorites. Well, that's how you win. Is you don't play a lot of favorites. And that's the good lesson for any horse player, whether you're beginning, intermediate, or advanced. Try to find a way to get around the favorite. That's what I try to do as much as possible, and that's what you should be trying to do as well. So a big congratulations to Dan. Hope we see you around at the track. I know he's a Chicago native, so hope to see him, though, around the track, whether it's in the Midwest or up here in New York. And Dan, feel free to play on NYRA Bets. So listen, going to be a lot of fun this weekend at Fairgrounds, and can't wait to see a lot of great racing up there. Myself and Kaylee Shapiro are going to be back with a preview of the Louisiana Derby, I should say, as well as the Fairground Oaks and the Jeff Ruby Stakes and the Bourbonnette Oaks taking place at Turfway Park. And then on Friday, I'll be back for a Capping the Card where I go through all 12 races on Saturday's Fairgrounds card and give you my top pick and top value play. Well, like I said, make sure to press that like and subscribe button. My name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and prosperous day at the races, my friends, and reminding you it's now post time.